All right, by my clock, it is now 15 minutes after the hour. So we are all ready to resume. So I would like to welcome Klaus Wolf from EBSCO, who is going to talk to us about bringing high quality academic resources to incarcerated students and how VuFind is involved in that.
All right, thank you so much, and a wonderful good morning, afternoon, or evening to everyone here. Before I get started, I really wanted to ask you all to take a quick second to think about this question. What's the first thing you think about when you hear or read the word prison? And I'm pretty sure it's not VuFind. And I thought maybe you're looking at something like this, place with lots of cells. Or maybe you think about something like this, like big towers and barbed wire. And some of you might be thinking orange is the new black, even though I wouldn't recommend that. I don't think that's the reality. So what does all of this have to do with VuFind? I was involved in a project a little while ago that brings truly high quality academic resources to incarcerated students. And that was the first thing I had to learn as a foreigner. It's not prisoners, right? It's incarcerated students. And it's very interesting what that means. So before I go into details about how VuFind is involved, I just want to very quickly introduce myself so you know who I am. That's roughly what I looked like this morning when I did that presentation. I'm a manager of library service engineering, but I got to this particular project when I was basically working as a consultant for EBSCO, consulting with various corporate and government customers. So education makes a massive difference in the life of incarcerated students. And so do your contributions to VuFind. And I want to show you how that is possible. The first thing is I've given you that picture of prison cells and barbed wire. But this too is a reality in prisons. There's people who have an electronic device from Samsung or a different provider, and they actually can do research on these tablets. It's extremely limited, but it's important to know we don't always need to think about prisons as these bad places, but there's places where people are being helped to basically get back into day-to-day and good life. But did you know, in 2016, there were 2.3 million prisoners in the United States alone. And to give you a feeling for how big that is, that's roughly the population of Houston, Texas. So all over the United States, there were 2.3 million people imprisoned. What is more staggering is that roughly 2/3 of these people will reoffend within 3 years of release. And that's a very, very sad statistic, because that means the prison population basically keeps growing, because not only is there new crime committed, but there's old prisoners returning. And every time they return, their chances of rehabilitation actually reduces. However, there is a 43% reduction in recidivism that can be directly attributed to students within a prison system who receive post-secondary education. And that's something that's really important. So every prisoner in the United States who doesn't have a high school diploma is given the opportunity to get their GED, which is basically an equivalent of the high school diploma. But that is not the type of education we're looking at here. We're truly talking about post-secondary education, so colleges. And if you take a look at the type of degree those students attain while they're in prison, the risk of recidivism is 40% for those with an associate's degree. So you can already see that's way lower than the 2/3 in the general population. It's only 5.6% for those with a bachelor's degree, and apparently it's 0% for those with a master's degree. Now, the statistics come straight from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, but we would need to take a much closer look at how many people actually got their master's degree, and is that a meaningful number? So I much rather look at the first two, because they are more attainable educational goals within that environment. The solution, therefore, seems quite clear. The prisons and departments of corrections simply partner with colleges to offer educational programs within the confines of the prison. There's one big problem. Academic literature is not something that's easily to get to while you're in prison. As you can imagine, they have lots of restrictions. And one of these restrictions is there is simply no open internet for very, very good reasons. So as EBSCO, we would say, well, that's simple, simply whitelist ebscohost.com and you're golden. But there is no open access to the internet, and the thought of just letting students get access to any type of content is completely out of the question. What is perfectly benign to you and me might be contraband information within a prison environment. So there need to be content controls so that every piece of full text information is actually vetted for appropriateness before it's being given to a student. But there's also a higher goal of equal opportunity. So the first two needs are imposed by the prison. But if you look at equal opportunity, those colleges who get paid, they get tuition fees. They actually want to empower students to continue their education on the outside. They want to make sure that these students have as equal an education as possible. And so that equal opportunity needs to be given not just with the content they're being taught, but also their access to academic literature. And from a practical point of view, it needs to be very easy to maintain, because if you expect a IT department in a prison to look after a VuFind server, you're going to be very, very hard bound to find that as something that's possible. And before I go on, I just want to quote Jeannie Colson, who was the librarian at the Lee College Huntsville Center in Texas, who came up with the basic idea of correctional ed. And she very much said the students have the ability to grow in information literacy almost to the degree their free world students can. And that's a pretty big achievement if you consider what the previous state was. But before we get there, let's talk about what this looks like. So there's a screenshot. It's pretty much a standard VuFind with a few changes to it. And I'll talk a bit more about these. So the first challenge, there is no open internet. So our first client needed the solution to be able to run on a desktop computer. It was a Windows 10 machine, I believe, which serves as a server for Computer Lab. And they have about 6 of these, and they have Computer Lab, and each of the computers can only connect to that one desktop computer that's is basically the server. A bit later on, we worked with the Departments of Corrections and a company in the US called APDS, American Prison Data Systems, who actually provide a cloud-based intranet for their dedicated devices. So you might remember a bit earlier, I showed you that image of a student with a tablet device. They would be served by APDS, but this is an intranet. It still doesn't have access to the open internet. It just happens to have whitelisted a few very specific IPs from APTS. But what did it mean before the solution? There's a teacher here, and I got confirmation from Jeannie that it was okay to share this image. But if you take a close look at, there is like these 2 big books. And each of these books represent 1 year worth of publication information. So a dedicated teacher going into these facilities might have like a couple of years worth of publication information. And the best that students could hope for is to take a look in these clunky books to try and find literature. The reality for the vast majority of students was their lecturer would bring in the literature they thought they should be reading. So they didn't truly have equal opportunity in finding information. So VuFind made a massive change to this. So we don't need internet. Everything runs on that desktop server just fine. It's relatively easy to install based on really good guidance on the VuFind website. So you don't need to be a super specific hardcore IT person. A standard librarian can do that quite easily. And from my point of view, the ability to extend the functionality by writing your own module and theme was very, very easy, because that meant we could focus on just the few changes the customer needed and allow the core VuFind information to take care of the rest. So basically, we got a lot of functionality for free, which in a consulting point of view, where we're not having unlimited funds, where we're not basically building this as a big scalable product, but something that we do for one customer, that was a really much welcome feature, because we could reduce our cost tremendously as a result. However, prisons are prisons, and there's content controls. Not all content is created equal. I already said that. What you and I think is perfectly fine is perfectly contraband in a prison, and people need to review it. So the solution we're making available basically is an abstract and indexing database. The students must request access to a PDF, so they have a button they can click and they will be able to make a request. And there is an approver module for those people who get to approve the document to preview the PDF and then basically download it to the server and make it available. The database itself is made up of academic search and business source, and there are some statistical facts about these databases. I believe they're very well known throughout the library community. They're very well known and they're used by libraries around the world, which was a big plus. So we didn't give those students something that people have never heard of or that gets rarely used, but they have access to something that students all over the world have access to. We help the librarians by creating a monthly Solr index of those roughly 30 million records that we make available via this way. So we run the process, it creates the Solr index, and as long as we're all in the same version of VuFind, which we are, we can zip up that index and just basically put it on S3, and our librarians goes and downloads it, and 30 minutes later, they are in business having that full index, saving them a lot of trouble. But initially we thought, great, we have the data, we know how to do a pipeline, and you, dear librarian, run this yourself. That was an utter and complete and total failure. That was not working too well. But this is what's happening. We are obtaining XML via FTP. So we don't have access to some super secret EBSCO stash of data. This is XML files that are made available for very specific use cases. We then, via the Python apply some content filters. So there's some date restrictions. There are some publication types. So out of curiosity, news items are extremely unpopular in a prison because there might be a newspaper article about that student 3 cells down from you that killed a person. You really don't want to disclose that about another person. So newspaper articles just had to go and be removed from the get-go. And there's a whole bunch of other filter rules that we apply before it even hits the index. Then there's a pretty standard XSLT transformation to match the VuFind Solr schema. And we build browser indexes, zip it up. And as I said, it takes us about 60 hours on a pretty normal EC2 instance. And the customer is done in about 30 minutes. That includes usually downloading it from the S3 bucket that we make available. But there's one more thing. So we have abstracting and indexing data that's accessible to students in a computer lab, or in the very best case, via that tablet device that they might be allowed to bring into their cell. But how do they get hold of that PDF? Because so far, we only made available abstract and indexing content. And for this, we built an approver tool. And just like every good proof of concept, I built that about 3 times because the first time I thought, awesome, I'm just going to build a module. It's going to live in VuFind because I wanted it to speak to the VuFind database in the background, and I'm done. A hard lesson, the prisons are so well secured that the lecturers, when they were back in their office, couldn't actually access the same network. So we had to come up with a way of building a separate approver tool that would be accessible from the outside, but not from the inside. So it's running on a different port on the same server, but still talking to the same database. But it took me a few times to get this right. And obviously there's a load balancer that protects the intranet, but also makes available that approver tool on the outside. The students will submit a request form, and their details are filled in from a single sign-on that we get. APDS uses Keycloak, and so we use Simple SAML PHP as the service provider on the server to then connect to VuFind and fill in the account information for that user. And then the approver sees the request, can preview the full text, approve it or decline it, and they do that quite regularly, and off we go. So what does that look like? This is that's kind of a demo version of EBSCO Correctional Ad. Every customer has some of their own branding, so it doesn't say EBSCO at all. It says Minnesota Department of Corrections or Kansas Department of Corrections. And we also made all the buttons to be touch targets because the real use case is a tablet device. So what they do is they do their search. They have a whole bunch of filters. They can be quite specific via the advanced search. And then they get to click on request full text access, and that will only be available for a record that has full text within the EBSCO database. They fill in this form, And some of this information gets filled in from the SSO, and this is basically the first name, last name, that DOC number, the Department of Correction number. Obviously, all of that is fake data. And then we have a mapping to the facility. So when they select this facility, it gives them only the colleges that operate in that facility. And then once they select the college, only the program that actually operates there. And rather than building a new data structure, all of this information beautifully fits into a VuFind table that already exists. We just had to repurpose. I think one field didn't quite make sense, but we still repurposed it, and it fit in really nicely. And we preload that information so the student doesn't have to fill it out every time. Then we've got information about the document they're requesting. And the most important bit probably is this accession number. And the student needs to fill in a request reason. And they go off and request the document. They will be shown, we received this, we'll review it in X amount of time. And in this case, it actually reminds them of how many documents they can request in a specific period and how many they have already requested. So it also queries the database real quick to see the student doesn't go and request everything under the sun, because those approvers are very busy people and they just don't have time. So it forces the student to be absolutely certain that this is something that they want to do. Now, something I'm not showing here very well, but that's mentioned here, we're actually adding this, this request to a folder that we create, and that is called My Requests. And so basically everything the student has requested ends up in their account in a folder labeled My Requests. And so what does the approver see? They get to something like this where they log in with a user ID and password. They see a long queue of all the requests, and they can filter this based on the facilities. And this down here was my request. And then they could click on preview here and approve. And the reality is it doesn't look pretty here because the approve button is never there for the approver actually in this tool. Because it was made, a decision was made by the people we worked with, is they needed to ensure that if it got rejected, that the approver actually looked at the document. So when they click here, that's the only time we actually speak to the open internet. This goes to the EBSCO EDS API and actually pulls down the PDF and the information. You can go and approve it. It shows up in this My Requests folder I told you about. And as you can see, for every single one of these, you see the current status. This is requested. You can view this right now so the student knows what has been approved and what hasn't. And in the rare case that it does get declined, they would see a big red, you can't have this. It says something slightly different, much nicer, but it really is, no, you're not going to have this. And this is on a per user basis. But once a document has been approved, the next person requesting it doesn't have to wait until somebody reviewed it again. It gets automatically approved for them. But all of this is standard VuFind functionality. So there's an Ajax thing running. It's pretty much the same thing that would go and check if it's available in your ILS. The same type of lazy loading is happening here to check if this document is approved, pending approval, or has been declined. And then student can view the document, use it. There's a PDF viewer in here. There's a big button for them to download it to their device if that's something that's allowed. So it's a pretty reasonable experience for the students. Request handling is easy in the intranet type of state. Now, at Lee College Huntsville Center, it's a bit more basic. The student is asked to write down on a piece of paper the accession number and the reason for their request. Then poor librarian has to go off when they're back in their office, gets all the requests, obtains the PDFs, prints them out, delivers them to the student the next time they're on site. But remember, that's a site that doesn't have any intranet at all. So that's still a pretty good experience for the student. Question about equal opportunity is kind of an important one. Should be modern support information literacy, and I think we can kind of tick this because the VuFind solution is that. It's modern. It helps support information literacy. Students should come away with not just the information, but the skills that can be applied. We have those VuFind installations all over the United States, Germany, and the world, and it's very similar to other systems. So they actually learn a skill along with getting access to the data. And the key is there were solutions previously that were kind of similar, but they had old data. They weren't current. They weren't updated very often. So what this does, and that helps that equal opportunity thought, it gives them current academic multidisciplinary literature that's updated monthly, which sounds really slow to you and I, who are all used to getting daily updates for things. But in this case, it actually is pretty cool because once a month is very, very frequent for that use case. So when we built the solution, we worked with Jeannie, and she was awesome. She was the product manager in many ways, and she had great thoughts and ideas. And we also have to say a big thank you to Damon, because I do believe Jeannie reached out to him more than just once to ask questions, and it has always informed things. Jeannie made sure I didn't cut any corners. So did I think we needed a North American industry classification code search? Personally, I didn't think that was it, but Jeannie was adamant that if this is something you can do in EBSCO host, she wants to teach her students about it so they could do this on this VuFind solution as well. So we built this. Jeannie was also very adamant, and I salute her for it, because it's so easy for me to say, that's not really minimal viable product, but she insisted we needed proper browse indexes. So there is subject browse, an author browse, and a journal title browse in the application that we are also pre-building for Jeannie every month. So that also gets delivered in that S3 bucket download that she gets. The advanced search is a pretty nice touch, and big kudos to whoever did the citation formatting, because as long as you stick to getting the schema right and you don't skip any major, if you don't make shortcuts there, you get a pretty well formatted citation. It might not be perfect, but it is pretty close to good, and it teaches students, again, what to do here. So again, this is what you get in the advanced search. It's very basic. VuFind, there was my field. Maintenance. I think that's the biggest lesson that I took away. If you expect an IT department in a prison to actually care, they have bigger fish to fry that are far more serious than academic research. So we could not rely on them. The content updates really needed to be something that Jeannie could do, or anyone else. And in the case of APDS, there was only one way of logging in. We could not allow people to use the database-driven user ID and password. It had to happen via their key cloak for SSO. And just very recently, they even removed the service provider-initiated flow and are forcing an IDP-initiated flow for the authentication. So it works perfectly for the students, but it's really a different type of functionality piece. It was way more service than we planned, I will be very honest. So initially, as I said, we thought we'd provide the XML, maybe the data processing pipeline, and Jeannie, you're off on your own, and we're doing the whole thing ourselves right now. And I actually think that's the better service, even though that's not what we had planned for. The hosting partner, APDS, great bunch of people, but they don't have a lot of experience with VuFind. So every so often, my colleague Jim Knight and I basically build up a VPN tunnel to their service center and SSH into the service to perform some basic maintenance. And at 30 million records, and maybe not the biggest server for that load, that can be quite a challenge in its own. What's the future direction of this? We started this like a year plus ago, and it has been running and it has been implemented and it's going well. But we are now considering offering prisons the ability to go with Stacks, which is an EBSCO SaaS solution where they can basically whitelist the Stacks IP, and then there would be an EDS API behind it and still have the same approver flow. So we're kind of moving away from it, but for certain prison systems, it will continue to be a VuFind solution. Considering the time, I thought I'll just throw this up here, but I also want to say a big thank you for whoever came up with the idea of VuFind Multisite. But because on that APDS server, rather than having 5 installations, we have 1 installation, so 1 index, and we just happen to have a multi-site setup. So they all have their own theme, they have their own database, everything is nicely separated, and the rest gets handled by both the SSO flow, because that will double check the user is not trying to log into the wrong version of this, and the load balancer on the APDS side that will basically stop you from going to the wrong multi-site instance of that VuFind. But that works really well. And this is the current librarian, Jessica, and that was what she said about the solution. And I think it's really important to remember the access to information is extremely limited. the ability to update the database with current authoritative and scholarly research is a game changer in her point of view. And she had to go through all the pain of manually doing it, right? Going to all those 6 computer labs and plugging in a hard drive and copying indexes across. But it really works well. And the purpose of me coming to tell you about this was really to say thank you, VuFind community, because we used that code base. And yes, there was a whole bunch of code and customizations and consulting being committed to this outcome. But we could not have done this without an engaged open source community that's supporting each other when there's questions coming up, that has reasonably good documentation, right? We all know it could always be better, but it could be way worse. And then the best thing is, if questions do show up, there's a community that actually answers them. So my biggest thank you go to Damien and all the other people who do respond to the listserv, who do respond to the Slack channel, who actually care enough to help us do this. So even though I presented this and you see EBSCO slapped on every single slide, it was for me to show you there's an unusual use case for VuFind, and to say thank you to every single one of you who has ever committed code to this, because it made my life way easier. And I think that was a pretty nice thing for all of you to do. And we appreciate it a lot. And I do believe those students appreciate it. So from that, thank you so much. And if you have questions, feel free to send them my way. All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have a
Thanks so much,
question.
Claus. Yep, go ahead.
It seems that the panelists can't use the Q&A, so I have to ask aloud. Anyway, it's a really interesting presentation. Thank you, and interesting idea of shipping the solar index around. I'd be interested in knowing more about how large the index is. How many records do you have? How much disk space does it take? And if you index any full text also in the index.
Yeah, so it's about 30 million records, and that takes about 30 gigabytes of space. In order to make all of Genie's special index stuff, there was a lot of putting stuff in special fields to make that happen. But it's together with the browse index that also gets zipped up, it's about a 30 gigabyte file, which we obviously zip up, and it nicely compresses down to something much more manageable when you download this. So it's a pretty sizable index, and if those machines were weak, I think that would be disaster, but we've thrown all the RAM at it that we could get them to install. Let's put it this way. This machine has all the RAM. But no, there's no full text searching. I think I should be explaining that too, but that is partially requirement and partially practicality of not indexing this. So the requirement is that the content cannot be disclosed, right? So imagine there was content that's inappropriate, but you can search for it. And now imagine we were to show a snippet. We might actually be disclosing some aspect of the full text that's not there. So we could say, okay, let's remove the snippet. But then how do you know this was actually a relevant search result? So that's the practical requirement. The reality, however, is also that the XML I'm hooking into only has ANI content. So if I wanted to go and index the full text, I would now need to go and download for all of these records, the PDF, see that it has an OCR layer and index that. That would be maybe a bit more than our little process can handle. And I really don't want to know how big the index would be after that. Certainly not desktop grade anymore. Let's put it this way.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you.
Yes, I'll jump in with a quick question if there's no one else ahead of me. You mentioned using simple SAML for authentication, and I've been thinking that maybe that's something that should be a standard feature in VuFind in the future, since right now the main way to do SAML is through Shibboleth, and I could see direct connections being more convenient. Is that something that would be beneficial to you, or that might be contributable from your code?
It's a nasty hack at my end, so no. In order to, initially I had the hardest time to figure out how to do this, and I had to do it under an enormous time constraint, because that requirement was basically told to me like a week before it had to ship. So that was like not a good place. So I ended up with a really bad implementation that we can only get away with because they're all behind firewalls. So all these people don't actually are on the open internet, and because we need to direct them to the right multi-site along the way. So it's still secure. It passed the review by the Department of Corrections that are using it, but I would consider it a nasty hack. So sorry, not there, but I do believe I can ask my colleague, Mike Abramson. I think he used Simple SAML PHP for a site that uses VuFind with Folio. And so maybe his implementation might be something that can be contributed. I'll ask him.
That would be great. Thank you.
That would be great indeed. That's a good idea.